Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are stories we tell ourselves to make the darkness bearable. Stories about heroes who stand against impossible odds. About golden champions who carry the light into the void. About fathers who sacrifice everything so their children might survive. We cling to these stories because without them, the darkness would be too much. Without them, the suffering would have no meaning, and a universe without meaning is one that will drive you mad if you stare into it long enough. And in the vast, sprawling mythology of the 41st millennium, no story is told more fervently, more desperately, more universally than the story of the Emperor of mankind. He is the savior, the protector, the undying guardian who holds back the tide of annihilation with nothing but the sheer force of his will and the agony of 10,000 years spent rotting upon a golden chair. Trillions of human beings whisper his name in prayer every single day. Billions of soldiers march into the most horrific wars imaginable with his name on their lips and his icon pressed against their chests. Entire worlds burn, their populations consumed by virus bombs and orbital bombardments, so that other worlds might live under his protection for another generation. Mothers name their children after his saints. Workers toil in factory hives so dark and so vast that they will never see natural sunlight, producing munitions for wars they will never understand. And they do it willingly because they believe the Emperor watches over them. And through it all, across 1,000,000 worlds scattered beneath 1,000,000 alien stars, the Imperial Creed assures every frightened, suffering, exhausted human soul that the Emperor protects, that all of this suffering has meaning, that the man on the throne is worthy of every sacrifice made in his name. But what if that story is wrong? What if we have been looking at this galaxy through a lens so distorted by propaganda, that's so warped by 10,000 years of religious indoctrination that we cannot see the shape of the thing in front of us? What if the most terrifying villain in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is not lurking in the eye of terror, whispering corruption from behind the veil of reality? What if the greatest monster in the setting has been staring us in the face the entire time, wrapped in gold and bathed in the desperate prayers of a species he led to ruin? What if the God Emperor, the being they call the master of mankind, is not the savior of humanity, but its jailer? Tonight, I want you to settle in, get comfortable, let the world outside quiet down for a while, because I am going to take you on a long, winding journey through the hidden history of the Imperium. We are going to pull back every curtain, examine every shadow, question every assumption, and follow every thread of evidence to its uncomfortable conclusion. We are going to talk about decisions that were made tens of thousands of years ago that still echo through the screams of dying worlds in the 41st millennium. We are going to talk about betrayals so vast they encompass entire species, and lies so fundamental they form the bedrock of a galactic civilization. We are going to talk about why the Emperor of mankind is, and has always been, the real villain of Warhammer 40,000. Now, before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. This is not a simple argument. The beauty of the Warhammer universe, the thing that has kept people fascinated with it for decades, is that it resists easy moral categories. There are no white hats and black hats in the grim darkness of the far future. There are only shades of grey so dark they are nearly indistinguishable from one another. The Emperor did genuine good. He had genuine reasons for many of his actions. The threats facing humanity were and remain existentially real. And none of that is in dispute. But when we lay out the full scope of his decisions, his betrayals, his manipulations, his catastrophic failures of empathy and leadership, a pattern emerges that cannot be ignored. A pattern that suggests the Emperor was not a hero brought low by circumstance, but an architect of suffering whose grand design contained the seeds of every horror that would follow. The Horus Heresy, the 10,000 years of darkness, as the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers to keep a corpse alive on a golden chair, the totalitarian nightmare that the Imperium became. All of it traces back to choices he made. choices that were not forced upon him by fate or necessity, but choices that flowed naturally from who he was and what he wanted. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us go back to a time before the Imperium, before the Great Crusade, before the Primarchs and the Space Marine legions. Let us go back to old Earth, or to the shattered remnant of a world that had once reached the stars and fallen back into barbarism. Let us go back to the moment when a being who had lurked in the shadows of human history for tens of thousands of years decided that the time had come to step into the light and reshape the species in his own image. Because that is where the story of the real villain begins. And let me tell you, there is a lot of ground to cover. We are going to trace a trail of blood that stretches from the irradiated wastelands of ancient Terra to the burning shrine worlds of the 41st Millennium. We are going to examine the fate of forgotten warriors whose names were deliberately erased from history. We are going to follow a father's relationship with his sons as it curdles from indifference into catastrophe. We are going to look at a deal made with dark powers in a sealed vault, at a lie told to an entire species, and at a project so secret that its failure doomed every human being alive. And by the time we reach the end, I think you will agree that the being sitting on that golden chair deserves something very different from worship. And before we go further, let me say something that I think is important. I know this is going to be controversial. I know that for many fans of this setting, the Emperor occupies an almost sacred space in the narrative. He is the anchor of the entire mythology, the figure around whom everything else revolves, and challenging his heroism can feel almost sacrilegious, even in a fictional context. That reaction, that instinctive defensiveness, is itself telling. It mirrors the reaction that citizens of the Imperium would have if someone questioned the Emperor's divinity. It shows how effectively the narrative has been constructed, how deeply the assumptions have been embedded, how much we have internalized the imperial perspective without even realizing it. So I'm going to ask you to do something difficult. I am going to ask you to step outside the imperial perspective just for a while and look at the Emperor's actions the way an impartial observer would. Not someone who already believes he is a hero, not someone who already believes he is a villain, just someone who is looking at what happened, who did what to whom, and what the consequences were. And I think, best when you do that, the picture that emerges is not the one the Imperial Creed would have you see. The world that the Emperor emerged onto in the 29th millennium was not a kind place. That much is beyond argument. Terra, the birth world of humanity, had been through 5,000 years of absolute nightmare. The age of strife had torn apart the galactic civilization that humans had once built during the dark age of technology. Warp storms made interstellar travel impossible. Psychers, those unfortunate souls born with the ability to touch the immaterium, were appearing in greater and greater numbers, and many of them became conduits for demonic possession and horror. The men of iron, the artificial intelligences that humanity had once relied upon, had turned on their creators in a war that scarred civilization to its foundations. By the time the dust settled, Terra was a broken world, ruled by techno-barbarian warlords who fought over the scraps of a fallen golden age. Into this world stepped the Emperor. He had been alive for a very long time. The lore tells us he was born somewhere around the 8th millennium, before the Common Era, in a region that roughly corresponds to ancient Anatolia. He was the product of a mass psychic event. Thousands of human shamans pooling their souls together to create a single being of extraordinary power. Or perhaps he was simply a mutation, a perpetual, or one of those rare humans born with biological immortality and the ability to regenerate from any wound. The truth of his origin is deliberately left ambiguous, and that ambiguity is important because it means we cannot be certain of his motives, cannot peer into his mind with any confidence, cannot know whether his stated goals were ever his real ones. What we do know is that for tens of thousands of years, he chose to stay hidden. He walked the battlefields of ancient empires as they rose and fell. He watched the construction of humanity's earliest monuments and the destruction of its greatest civilizations. Some accounts suggest he was there at the dawn of agriculture, guiding early humans towards settled life. Others place him at key moments throughout recorded history, always watching, always calculating, always pursuing an agenda that no mortal could comprehend. He was, if the legends are to be believed, now present at almost every turning point in human development, nudging and steering from the shadows like a cosmic stage manager whose actors never knew they were being directed. But here is the thing that should trouble us about this. For roughly 40,000 years, this being of godlike power and intelligence watched humanity suffer. He watched plagues sweep across continents. He watched wars consume entire civilizations. He watched slavery, famine, genocide, and every other horror that our species has inflicted upon itself, and he did nothing, or rather, he did nothing visible. He intervened only when it served his long-term plan, which means that the suffering he did not prevent was suffering he had calculated into his equations and found acceptable. This tells us something profound about the Emperor's relationship with humanity. He did not love the species the way a parent loves a child. He loved it the way a gardener loves a crop. Yet he nurtured it when nurturing served his purposes. He pruned it when pruning was required, and he was perfectly willing to let large portions of it wither and die if doing so was the most efficient path toward his desired harvest. The Emperor's relationship with humanity was not one of care but of cultivation. He was growing something, shaping something, engineering an outcome that only he could see. And the individual plants that suffered and died along the way were acceptable losses in a much larger agricultural project. When he finally revealed himself during the Age of Strife, it was not because humanity's suffering had become unbearable to him. It was because the conditions were finally right for his plan. The warp storms were abating. The threat of chaos was reaching a critical threshold. Yeah, the psychic evolution of humanity was accelerating to the point where it could no longer be ignored. The Emperor emerged not out of compassion, but out of calculation. The moment had arrived, and the crop was ready for harvesting. This is not the behavior of a savior. Saviors act from empathy, from an inability to stand by while others suffer. The Emperor acted from strategy, from a cold assessment of optimal timing and maximum return on investment. And this distinction matters. How? Because it reframes every subsequent action he took. When the Emperor conquered Terra, he was not liberating its people. He was securing his base of operations. When he created the Primarchs, he was not giving humanity champions to protect them. He was manufacturing generals to prosecute his war. When he launched the Great Crusade, he was not reuniting the human family. He was consolidating his holdings. Everything the Emperor did, from first to last, was in service of his plan. And his plan was never about making humanity happy or free or prosperous. It was about making humanity survive, on his terms, in the form he deemed acceptable, regardless of what the individual humans caught up in the machinery might want for themselves. He walked among humanity as a shadow, guiding from behind the scenes, nudging civilization in directions he deemed favorable. He watched empires rise and fall. He watched religions form and dissolve. Yet he watched humanity reach the stars and then lose everything. And through all of it, he did nothing overt, nothing public, nothing that would reveal his existence to the wider world. Then, suddenly, he changed his mind. The official imperial narrative says that the crisis of the Age of Strife forced his hand, that the growing threat of chaos and the proliferation of dangerous psychers meant he could no longer afford to remain hidden. And that may be true. But it is also true that his emergence was not the act of a reluctant savior. It was the act of a conqueror. When the Emperor revealed himself to Terra, he did not come bearing olive branches. He came bearing the Thunder Warriors, an army of genetically modified super soldiers specifically designed for one purpose: war. These were not diplomats. They were not peacekeepers. They were weapons of mass destruction in human form, unstable and violent and utterly devastating on the battlefield. And the Emperor used them to carve a bloody path across the face of terror, crushing every civilization, every kingdom, every culture that refused to submit to his vision of a unified humanity. Now, some of these civilizations were genuinely terrible. The techno-barbarian warlords of old Earth included cannibalistic death cults, gene-splicing tyrants, and regimes that made the darkest chapters of human history look mild by comparison. Defeating them was, arguably, a moral necessity. But the Emperor did not limit his conquest to the irredeemably evil. He destroyed everything. Religious civilizations were targeted specifically. The last church on Terra was burned not because it posed a military threat, but because the Emperor viewed religion itself as a disease to be eradicated. An entire Antarctic civilization was annihilated with nuclear weapons because its people held religious beliefs. The Moreland Sen Confederacy, which practiced human sacrifice under the unknowing influence of the dark gods, was crushed and its ruler executed by the Emperor personally. But so were civilizations whose only crime was refusing to kneel. The record shows that there were exceptions. The Albions, who fought the Emperor's forces to a standstill, eventually accepted a diplomatic solution. The Emperor appeared before their clan lords, unarmed, and won them over with his vision and his charisma. And this proves something critical. He was capable of diplomacy. He was capable of persuasion. He was capable of achieving unity without bloodshed when he chose to be. The fact that he so rarely chose it tells us something about what he valued and what he did not. There is a story told in the lore about the Emperor visiting the last church on Terra before its destruction. He spoke with its priest, a man named Uriah Olather, and engaged him in a long philosophical debate about the nature of faith and reason. The Emperor argued passionately against religion, claimed it was the source of humanity's suffering, insisted that only through reason and science could the species survive. And then he burned the church down, not because the priest had threatened anyone, not because the building housed weapons or warriors, but because the Emperor had decided that faith itself was the enemy, and he would tolerate no dissent from that position. This is the pattern that would define everything that followed. The Emperor was not interested in building a society that could accommodate different perspectives, different beliefs, different ways of being human. He was interested in building a society that reflected his will, his vision, his understanding of what humanity should be. And anything that deviated from that vision was not debated or reformed or gradually integrated. But it was destroyed. The Unification Wars ended with the Battle of Mount Ararat, and with that battle came the first great crime that the Emperor would commit. A crime so monstrous, so calculated, so utterly cold-blooded that it should have served as a warning to every being in the galaxy about the true nature of the man they were about to call master. Picture them for a moment. The Thunder Warriors. Men who had been ordinary human beings before the Emperor's scientists took them apart and rebuilt them into something greater. They had given up their identities, their bodies, their very humanity in service to the Emperor's dream. They had fought and bled and died across the battlefields of terror. They had believed in him, believed that the unity he promised was worth every sacrifice, every scar, every brother lost in the grinding horror of the Unification Wars. And at the very moment of their greatest triumph, with the last enemy fortress falling and the banner of unity being raised over a planet finally at peace, the Emperor betrayed them. The official Imperial history records that all surviving Thunder Warriors died heroically in the final battle. The famous Aric Tyrannus, known as the Lightning Bearer, supposedly raised the banner of lightning at the Declaration of Unity before dying of his wounds. It was a beautiful story, a fitting end for humanity's first genetically enhanced champions, a tale of sacrifice that could inspire generations to come. Every word of it was a lie. The truth, concealed for more than 10,000 years, was that the Thunder Warriors did not die in battle. They were systematically exterminated by the Emperor's own forces. Custodian guards, led by the legendary Constantin Valdor, along with prototype Space Marines from the very first Legion, had carried out a merciless culling of the warriors who had won the Emperor his throne. The men who had given everything for the dream of a unified terror were murdered by the being they had served, at the precise moment when their service was no longer required. The justifications offered in the law are clinical and pragmatic. The Thunder Warriors were unstable, we are told. Their genetic enhancements were imperfect, causing mental instability and metabolic collapse. They had been designed for war and were not suitable for peacetime governance. They would have been a destabilizing element in the new society the Emperor wished to build. In purely utilitarian terms, disposing of them was the logical choice. But consider what this reasoning actually means. The Emperor created these men. He designed their flawed genetics. He chose to make them powerful but unstable, knowing from the beginning that they would be disposable. But he did not create them as partners in his vision. He created them as tools, to be used and then discarded when their function was complete. And when the time came, he did not even give them the dignity of knowing why they were dying. He constructed an elaborate false narrative about their heroic last stand and embedded it so deeply in the historical record that it would take more than 10 millennia for the truth to surface. Think about that for a moment. The Emperor did not simply dispose of the Thunder Warriors. He created a story about their disposal that transformed murder into martyrdom, that turned betrayal into sacrifice, that made the victims into willing participants in their own destruction. He did not just kill them. He rewrote reality so that their killing became something beautiful. This is a skill that the Emperor would deploy again and again throughout his existence, the ability to reshape the narrative, as to make atrocity look like necessity, to make people grateful for the chains they wore. It is perhaps his most dangerous ability, more dangerous even than his psychic powers or his mastery of genetic science, because it means that even when you know what he has done, even when the evidence is right in front of you, you still find yourself wanting to believe the beautiful version of the story. You still find yourself reaching for justifications, for excuses, for the comforting fiction that this was somehow different from what it so clearly was. The Thunder Warriors who survived the cull lived out their remaining years in hiding, their bodies slowly deteriorating as the flawed genetics the Emperor had given them took their inevitable toll. Aric Taranis, the most famous of these survivors, eventually emerged from hiding during the Horus Heresy and drawn back into the currents of history by a conflict he could not have imagined when he first picked up a weapon in the Emperor's name. Even then, even after everything that had been done to him and his brothers, Taranis found it difficult to condemn the Emperor. The psychological conditioning, the charisma, the sheer force of the Emperor's personality, all of it worked to make even his most grievous victims reluctant to name him as their tormentor. And that reluctance, but that deeply embedded loyalty that persists even in the face of monstrous betrayal, is itself evidence of the Emperor's nature. Because it means he did not just use people. He engineered them to accept being used. He built their love for him into their very genes, making it as much a part of them as their enhanced muscles and their armored bones. He did not earn loyalty. He manufactured it. And manufactured loyalty is not loyalty at all. It is a form of slavery so sophisticated that the slaves do not even realize they are in chains. He wrapped their murder in a heroic myth and buried the truth so deep that only a handful of survivors ever knew what had really happened. Aric Taranis was one of those survivors. He escaped the cull and lived for centuries in hiding, carrying the knowledge of the Emperor's betrayal like a wound that would never heal. And remarkably, even Taranis bore no ill will toward his creator. He understood, he said, that the Thunder Warriors had always been merely a means to an end. He accepted his own disposability with a resignation that speaks volumes about the relationship between the Emperor and those who served him. They were not people to him. They were components in a machine, to be installed and removed as the design required. This is not the behavior of a hero. This is the behavior of a tyrant who happens to be building something large enough that individual lives become irrelevant. And the most chilling aspect of the Thunder Warriors' destruction is not the act itself, but what it reveals about the Emperor's fundamental approach to those who serve him. if he could betray his first warriors with such calculated efficiency, what did that mean for everyone who came after? A theory has circulated in lore discussions for years that the Emperor planned a similar fate for the Space Marines once the Great Crusade was finished. That the Primarchs and their legions, like the Thunder Warriors before them, were always intended to be temporary tools rather than permanent fixtures of the Imperium. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. The Emperor began transitioning governance away from the Primarchs and towards civilian administrators well before the heresy. He established the Council of Terror and began reducing the military's role in imperial politics. Some Primarchs, like Guilliman, recognized this and began planning for their legion's transition to peacetime roles. Others, particularly the Primarchs who would later turn traitor, saw the writing on the wall and feared they were being set up for the same betrayal that had claimed the Thunder Warriors. Whether or not the Emperor actually intended to destroy the Space Marines remains one of the great unanswered questions of the setting. But the fact that the question can be asked at all, that the precedent existed, that the Emperor had demonstrated beyond any doubt that he was willing to create sentient beings specifically to be discarded, tells us something essential about his character. He was a being for whom the ends always justified the means, and the means were always expendable. And here is where the argument for the Emperor as villain begins to take on its full weight. Because it was not just the Thunder Warriors, it was not just one act of calculated betrayal. It was a pattern of behavior that repeated itself across centuries and across the galaxy, touching everything the Emperor built and everyone who served him. A pattern of creation and disposal, of trust and betrayal, of grand promises and cold, pragmatic abandonment. The Thunder Warriors were the first to learn this lesson. They would not be the last. There is one more dimension of the Thunder Warriors' betrayal that deserves examination, because it speaks to a pattern that would repeat throughout the Emperor's existence. The Thunder Warriors were not just disposed of, they were replaced. The Space Marines, the Legiones Astartes, were already being developed before the Thunder Warriors were eliminated. The Emperor had his new model ready before he scrapped the old one. He did not discard the Thunder Warriors and then scramble to find a replacement. Yet he planned the transition with the same cold precision that he planned everything else. This means that during the final years of the Unification Wars, as the Thunder Warriors fought and bled and died to win the Emperor his throne, their replacements were already being assembled in laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains. The Emperor was shaking the hands of warriors he had already decided to murder, as accepting their salutes and their devotion, while their executioners were being grown in vats just a few levels below. The duplicity of this is breathtaking. It requires a capacity for emotional compartmentalization that goes beyond mere pragmatism into something that most people would recognize as genuinely sociopathic. And here is the most unsettling parallel. The Space Marines were a clear improvement over the Thunder Warriors. They were more stable, longer-lived, more disciplined, better suited to the long-term prosecution of the Great Crusade. The Emperor's decision to replace the Thunder Warriors was, in purely utilitarian terms, correct. The new model was superior to the old model in every measurable way, but that utilitarian correctness is precisely what makes it so troubling. Because if the Emperor could justify replacing the Thunder Warriors with a superior product, what happens when a superior product to the Space Marines becomes available? What happens when the Primarchs have served their purpose and a new generation of leaders is needed? What happens to any servant of the Emperor when their utility reaches its expiration date? The answer, as the Thunder Warriors learned, is that they are discarded, quietly, efficiently, and without remorse. And the beautiful myth that covers their disposal ensures that no one will mourn them, because you cannot mourn someone who died a hero, where you can only celebrate their sacrifice and feel grateful that they gave everything so that the rest of us might live. The Emperor did not just kill the Thunder Warriors. He ensured that their death would generate positive propaganda value. He monetized their murder, turning their blood into the coin of loyalty and their graves into recruitment posters for the next generation of disposable soldiers. This is not the behavior of a leader who values his followers. This is the behavior of a corporation liquidating redundant assets while maintaining positive brand messaging. And the fact that the Emperor was capable of this level of calculated manipulation before the Primarchs were even created tells us that the dysfunctional relationships he would later develop with his sons were not accidents or oversights. They were features of his personality. The Emperor did not fail at fatherhood because the situation was too complex or the stakes were too high. He failed because he was fundamentally incapable of viewing other beings as anything other than instruments of his will. Before we examine the Emperor's relationship with his Primarchs, the 20 demigod sons he created to be his generals, and the instruments of his will across the galaxy, we need to talk about how they came to exist in the first place. Because the origin of the Primarchs is not the clean scientific achievement that Imperial propaganda would have us believe. It is a story steeped in hypocrisy, deception, and a willingness to deal with the very forces the Emperor claimed to oppose. The lore tells us that during the Dark Age of technology, long before the Unification Wars, the Emperor traveled to a world called Molech. This was a night world, home to human settlers and their massive walking war machines, but it also concealed something far more significant beneath its surface, a gateway into the realm of chaos itself, and a portal leading directly into the Imperium, into the domain of the very entities that the Emperor would later declare to be humanity's greatest enemies. The Emperor entered that portal, and when he emerged, he possessed new knowledge and new abilities. Specifically, he possessed the knowledge required to create the Primarchs, those superhuman beings who would combine the pinnacle of genetic science with the energies of the warp itself. Now, but what exactly happened on the other side of that gateway is a subject of intense debate. A demon later told Horus that the Emperor made a bargain with the Chaos Gods, gaining godlike powers and knowledge in exchange for something, a deal he subsequently broke. Some interpretations suggest the Emperor merely stole knowledge from the warp without making any true bargain, and others suggest the deal was real and that the Emperor's betrayal of its terms is what ultimately motivated the Chaos Gods to scatter the Primarchs and engineer the heresy. But regardless of the specific interpretation, the core fact remains. The Emperor used the power of the warp, the power of the entities he would later tell all of humanity did not exist, to create his most important servants. The Primarchs were not purely scientific creations. They were infused with warp energy, imbued with supernatural charisma and power that went beyond anything genetics alone could produce. And this warp-touched nature is precisely what made them vulnerable to the corruption of chaos, a vulnerability the Emperor surely understood when he created them. Think about this for a moment. The Emperor spent thousands of years studying the warp. He understood its dangers better than any human being alive. He knew about the Chaos Gods. He knew about demonic corruption. Or he knew that beings with strong connections to the warp were inherently vulnerable to the whispers of entities that fed on emotion and desire. And he chose, deliberately and with full knowledge of the risks, to create 20 beings who were essentially lightning rods for chaos corruption, to infuse them with the very energies he claimed were too dangerous for humanity to interact with. Then, having created these warp-touched demigods, and he proceeded to lie to them about the nature of the warp and the existence of the entities within it. The Primarchs were not told about chaos. They were not warned about the specific dangers they faced as beings who had been partially forged from immaterial energies. They were not given the tools or knowledge they would have needed to protect themselves from corruption. Instead, they were told that the warp was simply a natural phenomenon, that demons were just alien creatures, that there was nothing supernatural about the universe at all. This is the foundation of the Imperial truth, and we will examine it more deeply later. But in the context of the Primarch's creation, the Emperor's deception was not merely philosophically problematic. It was a catastrophic strategic failure born of arrogance and an obsessive need for control. He created beings who were specifically vulnerable to a particular threat, then denied them any knowledge of that threat. It is as though he built a fortress with a known structural weakness, then refused to tell the garrison where the weakness was, because he did not trust them with the information. When the Chaos Gods scattered the Primarchs across the galaxy, tearing them from their gestation pods and hurling them through the warp to distant human worlds, the Emperor lost control of their development. Each Primarch grew up shaped by the culture of the world they landed on, for better or worse. Some, like Guilliman, landed on worlds that gave them stable, nurturing environments. Others landed on worlds that broke them. And when the Emperor finally found them, reuniting with his scattered sons one by one over the course of the Great Crusade, he made choices in handling each of them that would have consequences echoing across 10,000 years. Let us talk about Angron. Angron was arguably the most tragic of all the Primarchs. He landed on the world of Nuceria, as where he was immediately enslaved. The slave masters of Nuceria discovered this superhuman child and did what slave masters do. They broke him. They implanted crude cybernetic devices, called the butcher's nails, into his brain, technology designed to amplify rage and aggression while suppressing every other emotion. It was a form of psychosurgery that was slowly killing him, even as it turned him into the perfect gladiator. The nails rewarded violence with pleasure and punished peace with agony, essentially rewiring Angron's entire emotional architecture around suffering and killing. Despite this, Angron retained something of the nobility he had been designed with. He led a slave rebellion, inspiring his fellow gladiators to rise up against their masters. It was a doomed uprising, a Spartacus-like last stand against overwhelming odds, but it was also the one thing in Angron's entire existence that he had chosen for himself. He chose to fight and die alongside the people who had suffered with him. He chose brotherhood over survival. He chose, in the only way he could, to be human. And then, the Emperor arrived. He descended from orbit with a fleet of warships and an army of superhuman warriors. He had the power to save Angron's fellow gladiators. He had the military might to destroy the slave masters of Nuceria in an afternoon. A single orbital bombardment could have ended the conflict. But a handful of custodian guards could have turned the tide. The Emperor could have given Angron the one thing that might have earned his love and loyalty forever, the salvation of the people he cared about. Instead, the Emperor teleported Angron away from the battlefield and left his gladiator brothers and sisters to die. Just think about that. The Emperor had the power to save them and chose not to. He looked at Angron's rebellion, at the first thing this tortured, broken Primarch had ever loved. And he calculated that it was not worth the effort. The gladiators were not part of his plan. They were not useful to his design. And so they died on the red sands of Nuceria, while their champion was dragged screaming into a future he had never wanted. The Emperor could have done so many things differently with Angron. He could have used his psychic abilities to calm the maddened Primarch, to soothe the agony of the butcher's nails even temporarily, and to establish the kind of psychic rapport that would have shown Angron that this golden stranger was not just another master, but something genuinely different. The Emperor's psychic powers were vast enough to hold closed a webway portal against the combined might of demonic legions. Surely they were sufficient to ease the suffering of one broken soul, long enough to build a relationship founded on compassion rather than domination. He could have brought the gladiators aboard his ships. There was room. The Emperor traveled with fleets large enough to transport entire legions of space marines. A few hundred or even a few thousand freed slaves would have been a trivial addition. Many of them would have made excellent recruits for the Imperial army. Those too injured or too old to serve could have been settled on one of the Imperium's countless colony worlds, given land and purpose and the knowledge that their suffering had meant something. He could have simply waited. Yet the gladiators were surrounded, but still fighting. A few hours of orbital bombardment targeting the slave masters' positions would have turned the tide. A few days of negotiation, backed by the implicit threat of an emperor who could crush the entire planet without breaking a sweat, would have secured the gladiators' freedom without a single additional death. The emperor had time, he had power, he had options. And he chose the one option that would cause maximum emotional damage to the son he was supposedly trying to recruit. Why? The most charitable interpretation is that the emperor was in a hurry. that the Great Crusade demanded speed, that every day spent resolving Angron's situation was a day lost in the broader campaign to unite humanity. But this interpretation falls apart when you consider that the Emperor spent 111 days on Molech, doing whatever mysterious business required his attention there. He spent years on Terra working on the Webway project. He had time for the things that mattered to him.
Look, I want to take a quick second here to just talk to you directly, because I have been going back and forth on this topic for a long time. When I first got into this hobby, the Emperor was the good guy, full stop, no question. You read the lore, you see the golden armor, you hear about the sacrifice on the throne, and you think, yeah, that is the hero. That is what holding the line looks like. And honestly, part of me still feels that pull. There's something deeply compelling about a being who just suffers eternally so that everyone else gets to live. But the more I read, the more I sat with actual details, the timelines, the exposed decisions behind closed doors, the more that clean image started to crack, and not in a way where I think the Emperor is some cartoon villain twirling his fingers in the dark. It's more like he's the most tragic kind of failure, the kind that where you can see the good intentions underneath, but the arrogance and the secrecy and the refusal to trust anyone else just poisons everything he touches. But that's what makes this topic so fascinating, and I wanted to actually make this video. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
Angron's gladiators simply did not make that list. The less charitable interpretation, the one that the evidence better supports, it is that the Emperor did not save the gladiators because he did not see them as worth saving. They were not part of his plan. They were not useful to his design. They were, in his calculation, nothing more than the emotional baggage that his new weapon would need to shed before it could be properly deployed. And the fastest way to sever that emotional attachment was to let it die on the sands of Nuceria, along with every person Angron had ever loved. If this interpretation is correct, and the cold efficiency of the Emperor's actions strongly suggests that it is, then the Emperor deliberately traumatized Angron. He calculated that a Primarch driven by rage and grief would be more useful in certain combat situations than one motivated by loyalty and gratitude. He chose to create a weapon of pure fury rather than a loyal son, because fury was more immediately useful to his campaign. And when that fury eventually turned against him, when the broken weapon lashed out at the hand that had broken it, the Emperor had no one to blame but himself. Angron never forgave this. How could he? The Emperor had not simply failed to save his people. He had demonstrated, with absolute clarity, that the lives of those Angron cared about meant nothing to him. Angron was a tool, a weapon to be deployed in the Great Crusade, and tools do not get to choose who they fight for. The butcher's nails were already eating away at Angron's mind. But it was the Emperor's cold pragmatism that truly broke whatever remained of his spirit. When the Horus heresy came, Angron was among the first to turn. He saw the Emperor not as a father or a liberator, but as just another slaver, another master who used people up and threw them away when they were no longer convenient. And Angron was not alone in his suffering. Consider Lorgar, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers. Lorgar was perhaps the most devoted of all the Emperor's sons, as he genuinely believed that the Emperor was divine, a god in human form, and he dedicated his life and his legion to spreading that belief across the galaxy. The Word-Bearers did not merely conquer worlds during the Great Crusade. They transformed them. They built cathedrals and temples. They wrote scriptures and composed hymns. They created vibrant, devout civilizations that worshipped the Emperor with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism, but the Word-Bearers were slow. Their process of deep cultural transformation meant they conquered worlds at a fraction of the speed of other legions. And the Emperor, upon discovering what Lorgar had been doing, responded not with a conversation, or a gentle correction, or a fatherly discussion about priorities. He responded with devastation. The Emperor ordered the Ultramarines to destroy Monarchia, the city that the Word-Bearers considered their crowning achievement, their perfect city of devotion. Then he summoned the entire Word-Bearers Legion, all 100,000 Space Marines, to assemble on the planet's surface within sight of the smoldering ruins, and there, using his psychic power to force every single one of them, including Lorgar, to to their knees in the ashes, the Emperor told his son that he had failed, that he was no god and would suffer no such belief, that everything Lorgar had built and believed in was wrong. The humiliation was absolute. The destruction was total. And the cruelty was unnecessary. The Emperor could have spoken to Lorgar privately. He could have gradually redirected his son's energies. He could have used the very charisma and persuasion that he had demonstrated during the Unification Wars to guide Lorgar toward a different path. Instead, he chose the most devastating, most public, most psychologically damaging response possible. He broke his son's heart and his faith simultaneously in front of every warrior Lorgar had ever led. Is it any wonder that Lorgar, shattered and searching for meaning, eventually found gods who would accept his devotion? The Chaos gods did not have to work hard to corrupt Lorgar. The Emperor had already done the difficult part by destroying everything Lorgar believed in, without offering anything to replace it. Lorgar's fall to chaos was not a failure of the Primarch. It was a direct, predictable consequence of the Emperor's emotionally catastrophic leadership. And then there is Magnus. Magnus the Red was the most psychically gifted of all the Primarchs, a sorcerer of extraordinary power and a scholar of insatiable curiosity. He was also, by all accounts, one of the Primarchs most genuinely devoted to the Emperor's vision for humanity. Magnus believed in the future the Emperor was building. He wanted to be part of it. He wanted to understand the warp, not to serve its entities, but to master its power for humanity's benefit. The Emperor's response to Magnus was a masterclass in self-defeating paranoia. At the Council of Nicaea, a great convocation called to decide the fate of psychic powers within the Imperium. The Emperor ruled against the use of sorcery by the Space Marine legions. The Librarius divisions were disbanded, psychic powers were banned, and Magnus, who had built his entire legion's identity around their psychic gifts, was humiliated and effectively told that everything he valued was forbidden. The irony here is extraordinary. The Emperor was himself the most powerful psyker in human history. He used psychic powers constantly. The Astronomicon, the beacon that made interstellar travel possible, was powered by psychic energy. The entire Webway project depended on psychic abilities. The Emperor was simultaneously using sorcery to build his empire, while telling his son that sorcery was too dangerous to be permitted. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, and Magnus saw it clearly. But the worst was yet to come. When Magnus discovered through his psychic abilities that Horus had turned traitor, that the War Master was plotting to destroy the Imperium, he faced a terrible choice. The fastest way to warn the Emperor was through sorcery, through projecting his consciousness across the galaxy directly to Terra. Doing so would violate the Edict of Nicaea. But the alternative was to use conventional means of communication that might arrive too late to prevent catastrophe. Magnus chose to warn his father. He broke through the psychic barriers protecting the Imperial Palace on Terra and delivered his warning directly. But in doing so, he inadvertently damaged the Emperor's secret Webway project, tearing holes in the carefully maintained psychic wards that kept demons from flooding into the human-built sections of the Webway. The Emperor's response was not to listen to the warning. It was not to immediately investigate whether Horus had indeed turned traitor. Instead, furious at the damage to his project and at Magnus's violation of the Nicaea Edict, the Emperor sent the Space Wolves to bring Magnus to account. And Horus, already deep in his treachery, intercepted those orders and changed them from "bring Magnus to Terra" to "destroy Magnus and his legion." The result was the burning of Prospero. The Space Wolves, accompanied by custodian guards and Sisters of Silence, descended on the Thousand Suns homeworld and burned it to ashes. Magnus, heartbroken and believing himself abandoned by his father, accepted the destruction as penance for his mistakes. And when the flames died and the libraries of Prospero lay in ruins, Magnus had nowhere to turn except to Tsench, the very chaos god the Emperor had been trying to keep him away from. Magnus did not need to fall. If the Emperor had trusted him with the truth about the Webway project, Magnus would have understood why his warning caused such damage and could have avoided it. As if the Emperor had explained the real nature of the Chaos Gods to his son, Magnus would have been better equipped to resist their temptations. If the emperor had simply listened to the warning and investigated Horus's loyalty, the entire heresy might have been stopped before it began. But the emperor did none of these things, because sharing information, trusting others, acknowledging that he might need help, these were not things the emperor of mankind was capable of doing. His need for control, his obsessive secrecy, his fundamental inability to treat other beings as partners rather than tools, these were not weaknesses inflicted upon him by circumstance. They were core features of who he was, and they destroyed everything. And we have not even mentioned the two Primarchs who were erased entirely from Imperial history. The 2nd and 11th Primarchs, known only as the Forgotten and the Purged. Their records were so thoroughly destroyed that not even the traitor legions speak their names. 2 empty pedestals stand in the Imperial Palace where their statues once stood. Whatever they did, whatever happened to them, was apparently so threatening to the Emperor's narrative that complete erasure was the only acceptable response. Even the traitor legions, who openly rebelled during the Horus heresy, retained their place in the historical record. The Word-bearers, the World-eaters, the 1,000 Sons, all of them remain known and documented, despite their treachery. But the 2nd and 11th were subjected to something worse than being labelled traitors. They were subjected to non-existence, to a condemnation of memory so thorough that it erased them from the consciousness of an entire species. And we have not even discussed Perturabo, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors, whose entire existence was defined by being given the hardest, our most thankless assignments in the Great Crusade, and receiving neither recognition nor gratitude for completing them. Perturabo was a genius, a master of fortification and siege warfare, and the Emperor used him like a blunt instrument. While other Primarchs received glory and praise for their conquests, Perturabo was sent to the worst war zones, the bloodiest sieges, the campaigns that no one else wanted. He was told implicitly and explicitly that his role was to suffer so that others did not have to. The resentment this created was predictable. Any basic understanding of human psychology would tell you that a being subjected to relentless, thankless hardship will eventually break. And Perturabo did break. He turned to chaos, not out of religious fervor or psychic corruption, but out of sheer exhaustion and bitterness. He had given everything to the Emperor and received nothing in return, not even the acknowledgement that his sacrifices mattered. Then there was Mortarion, the Primarch of the Death Guard. Mortarion grew up on a world ruled by alien overlords who used toxic gases as weapons. He fought against them his entire life. And when he was on the verge of defeating the last and most powerful of these overlords, the Emperor appeared and struck the final blow himself. Think about what that meant to Mortarion. And his entire life had been defined by his struggle against the tyrants of Barbarous. It was his purpose, his identity, and the Emperor took that from him. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted to demonstrate his power, to show Mortarion that he was dealing with a being beyond his comprehension. It was a dominance display, pure and simple, and it left Mortarion with a burning resentment that would fester for centuries. Then there was Conrad Kersey, the Night Haunter. Here Kurz landed on the nightmare world of Nostramo, a planet so dark and so violent that it defies description. He survived alone, without any parental figures or supportive communities. He was tortured by psychic visions of the future, visions that showed him nothing but suffering and horror. He was, by any reasonable assessment, profoundly mentally ill. The Emperor gave him an army and pointed him at the galaxy's enemies. He took a traumatized, psychotic Primarch and gave him the power to commit atrocities on a galactic scale. And when Kersey inevitably descended further into madness, the Emperor expressed disapproval but took no meaningful action. Night Haunter is worth lingering on for a moment longer because his story illustrates the Emperor's failures with particular clarity. Conrad Kurz was a Primarch who could see the future, yet he had visions of darkness and suffering that plagued him from the moment of his birth on the nightmare world of Nostramo. He saw what the Imperium would become. He saw the corruption, the decay, the endless, meaningless suffering that awaited humanity, and he told the Emperor about these visions. He warned him, explicitly and repeatedly, that the path they were on led to damnation. The Emperor dismissed these warnings. He told Kersey that the future was not fixed. Asked that visions could be misleading, that Kersey should focus on his duties and stop worrying about things beyond his control. This was perhaps reasonable advice in isolation, but it was catastrophically wrong in context, because Kersey's visions were accurate. Everything he predicted came true. The Imperium did decay into a nightmarish theocracy. The Primarchs did turn against each other. The dream did die. Kersey saw it all coming. And the Emperor chose to ignore the warning because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging that his plan was flawed. A father who listens to his son's pain, even when that pain reveals uncomfortable truths, might have changed the course of history. The Emperor was not that kind of father. The pattern across every single Primarch who eventually turned traitor is the same. The Emperor identified a broken tool, failed to repair it, used it until it shattered, and then blamed the tool for breaking. Whatever the Emperor did to those two Primarchs and their legions, whatever crime or failure or inconvenient truth led to their destruction, the fact that he was willing to go further in punishing them than he went with the chaos-worshipping traitors tells us that the Emperor's definition of unforgivable had nothing to do with morality. It had to do with control, with maintaining his narrative, with ensuring that the version of reality he had constructed remained unchallenged. Now let us pull back from the personal tragedies of the Primarchs and look at the broader picture. Let us talk about the Great Crusade itself, the galaxy-spanning military campaign that the Emperor launched to reunite all of humanity's scattered colonies under a single government. Because the Great Crusade is where the Emperor's villainy moves from the personal to the civilizational, so where his choices stop affecting individual sons and start affecting billions of innocent lives. The official narrative of the Great Crusade presents it as a liberation. Humanity's scattered colonies had been cut off from one another for 5,000 years. Many had regressed into barbarism. Others had fallen under alien domination. The Great Crusade was supposed to rescue these lost populations, bring them back into the fold of human civilization, and protect them from the manifold threats of a hostile galaxy. And in some cases, that is exactly what happened. Worlds that had been enslaved by alien tyrants were freed. Populations that had been reduced to pre-industrial barbarism received the benefits of imperial technology and infrastructure. Genuine good was accomplished on a massive scale. But liberation was not the only thing the Great Crusade delivered. It also delivered extermination. Now, the process of bringing worlds into compliance with the Imperium was not optional. Worlds that did not wish to join were conquered. Civilizations that had developed differently during their millennia of isolation were forcibly restructured to match the Emperor's vision. Human cultures that had built thriving, peaceful societies in partnership with alien species were torn apart, their alien partners exterminated, and their populations brought to heel. So the scale of the xenocide conducted during the Great Crusade is genuinely staggering. Entire alien species were driven to extinction, not because they threatened humanity, but because the Emperor's ideology demanded it. The Great Crusade operated on a principle of absolute human supremacy that left no room for coexistence, no space for diplomacy with non-human intelligences, no possibility that the galaxy might be shared rather than dominated. There were alien species that had lived alongside human colonies in peace for centuries. There were civilizations, like the Interrex, who had achieved a sophisticated understanding of chaos and had developed effective methods for protecting themselves from its influence. The Interrex had even preserved forbidden knowledge about chaos in carefully guarded museums, knowledge that could have been invaluable to the Imperium in its war against the Dark Gods. But the Great Crusade did not come to learn, and it came to conquer. And the Interrex, along with their knowledge and their alien allies, were destroyed. Even human worlds that refused compliance faced devastating consequences. Civilizations that had independently developed artificial intelligence, for example, were not simply asked to dismantle their creations. They were exterminated outright. Every man, woman, and child on those worlds was killed, not for what they had done, but for what they might potentially do. Worse, the Emperor's fear of artificial intelligence, born from humanity's ancient war with the Men of Iron, was so absolute that he was willing to commit genocide against human populations to ensure it never arose again. And here is the thing that makes this particularly damning. The Emperor had alternatives. He had diplomacy. He had persuasion. He had the most charismatic beings in the galaxy at his command, the Primarchs, and any one of whom could have charmed entire civilizations into compliance without firing a shot. Guilliman proved this repeatedly on world after world. The Khan demonstrated it. Even Lorgar, before his fall, showed that cultural integration was possible without military conquest. But the Emperor chose speed over subtlety. He chose compliance over cooperation. He chose destruction over dialogue. Because the Great Crusade was not really about liberation. It was about control. And it was about building an empire vast enough and homogeneous enough to implement the Emperor's secret plans for humanity's future, plans he shared with no one and would sacrifice anything to achieve. The worlds conquered during the Great Crusade did not gain freedom. They gained a new master, one who demanded absolute obedience, absolute uniformity, and absolute rejection of everything that had defined their cultures during the millennia of independence. Religious traditions were burned. Artistic movements were suppressed. Local governments were replaced with imperial administrators who answered to a bureaucracy on a world most citizens would never see. Consider what was lost during the Great Crusade. Not just lives, though the death toll was astronomical. Not just civilizations, though hundreds of unique human cultures were erased from existence. What was lost was possibility. In every independent human civilization that the Great Crusade destroyed represented a different answer to the fundamental question of how humanity could survive in a hostile galaxy. Some of those answers might have been wrong, some might have been dangerous, but some of them might have been better than the Emperor's answer. Some of them might have contained insights that the Imperium desperately needed, but would never have, because those civilizations were ashes before anyone thought to ask what they knew. The Interrex are perhaps the most painful example. Here was a human civilization that had not only survived the age of strife, but had thrived. They had built a stable, sophisticated society that maintained peaceful relations with certain alien species. Most remarkably, they had developed a deep and practical understanding of chaos. They knew what the warp entities were. They knew how to guard against them. They had preserved this knowledge in carefully maintained repositories where it could be studied and used for defense without being allowed to corrupt. The forces of the Great Crusade destroyed them, and with the Interrex burned knowledge about chaos that the Imperium would spend the next 10,000 years dying for lack of. Their knowledge that might have warned the legions about the true nature of their enemies. Knowledge that might have prevented the heresy itself. The Emperor did not just conquer worlds. He burned libraries. Not physical libraries, though plenty of those burned too, but libraries of human experience, of accumulated wisdom, of hard-won understanding about the nature of the universe and humanity's place in it. He replaced all of it with a single ideology, the imperial truth, and declared that nothing else was needed. The Diasporex were another victim of this ideology. They were a nomadic, fleet-based civilization, humans and aliens living together aboard vast ships that traveled the stars in peaceful coexistence. They had no interest in conquest. They threatened no one. They simply wanted to be left alone to pursue their own way of life among the stars. When the Iron Hands Legion, under Ferrus Manus, encountered the Diasporex, there was a window for diplomacy. When the Diasporex were willing to share their knowledge, their technology, even their navigational data, all they asked in return was the freedom to continue their nomadic existence. Ferrus Manus destroyed them, not because they posed a threat, but because their very existence was a philosophical challenge to the Emperor's vision of human supremacy. The idea that humans could live alongside aliens as equals, that cooperation rather than domination might be a viable strategy for survival. This was heresy to the imperial truth. And so the Diasporex's ships were run down and destroyed one by one, their mixed human and alien crews killed without distinction. their accumulated centuries of peaceful cooperation erased from the historical record as if it had never existed. Consider the world of 6319, one of the first human worlds encountered during the Great Crusade. This was a planet that had maintained a recognizable civilization through the age of strife. Its people lived in something resembling a 20th century industrial society. They had governments, cultures, arts, sciences. They were doing fine. They had survived 5,000 years of galactic catastrophe without the Emperor's help, and there was no reason to believe they could not continue doing so. The Emperor's forces arrived and demanded their compliance. But when the people of 6319 understandably questioned why they should surrender their sovereignty to a self-proclaimed emperor they had never heard of, the response was invasion. Space Marines descended on a peaceful world and killed its soldiers. They toppled its government and replaced its institutions with Imperial compliant ones. They did this not because the world was in danger, not because its people were suffering, but because the Emperor's plan required that every human world fall under his authority, regardless of whether those worlds wanted his authority or needed his protection. This was repeated thousands of times across thousands of worlds. The Great Crusade touched approximately 1 million worlds over the course of roughly 2 centuries. On every single one of them, local sovereignty was extinguished and replaced with imperial governance. Local cultures were suppressed in favor of imperial standardization. Local religions were eradicated in favor of the imperial truth. Local technologies that did not conform to standard template construct patterns were confiscated and often destroyed. The diversity of human experience, the beautiful variety of civilizations that had emerged during millennia of isolation, all of it was crushed into a single homogeneous mold because one being had decided that his vision for humanity's future was the only acceptable one. The Great Crusade did not unite humanity. It consumed humanity. It swallowed a galaxy's worth of diverse, independent civilizations and replaced them with a single, suffocating monoculture that left no room for dissent, difference, or self-determination. And the Emperor was not merely complicit in this, he designed it. But he could have built an imperium that respected local autonomy, that preserved cultural diversity, that allowed for different approaches to the challenges of survival in a hostile galaxy. Guilliman's Ultramar proved that such an approach was possible, that an efficient, prosperous civilization could be built without crushing everything that made individual worlds unique. But the Emperor chose a different path, and billions suffered for it. At the ideological heart of the Great Crusade sat the imperial truth, the atheistic, rationalist doctrine that the Emperor promoted as the philosophical foundation of his new civilization. On its surface, the imperial truth seems reasonable, even admirable. It held that the universe was rational, that knowledge defeated fear, that science and reason were superior to superstition and faith. In an age when uncontrolled psyches and demonic incursions had caused untold suffering, as the appeal of a worldview that rejected the supernatural and embraced empirical understanding is obvious. But the imperial truth was not what it pretended to be. It was not a genuine philosophical framework built on honest inquiry and transparent evidence. It was a lie, a deliberate, carefully constructed deception designed to serve the Emperor's strategic objectives at the expense of truth itself. The Emperor knew about the Chaos Gods. He had interacted with them directly at Molech, where he understood that they were real entities with genuine power over the material universe. He knew that the warp was not merely a natural phenomenon, but a dimension shaped by and responsive to the emotions and beliefs of sentient beings. He knew that religious worship and psychic faith actually had measurable effects on the immaterium, strengthening the very entities he opposed. And knowing all of this, he chose to tell humanity that none of it was real. The imperial truth denied the existence of gods, demons, and the supernatural. It presented the warp as merely an unusual but fundamentally mundane physical phenomenon. It treated religion as nothing more than ignorance to be corrected, faith as nothing more than weakness to be overcome. The The Emperor's Thunder Warriors destroyed every church on Terra during the Unification Wars. His iterators, the philosophical missionaries of the Great Crusade, or spread this doctrine to every world the Imperium conquered, dismantling belief systems that had sustained communities for millennia and replacing them with a sterile rationalism that offered no comfort, no meaning, and no preparation for the real spiritual threats that humanity faced. The enforcement of the imperial truth was carried out with a zeal that bordered on mania. When the expeditionary fleets of the Great Crusade encountered human civilizations that practiced religion, the response was swift and uncompromising. The Emperor's iterators, those smooth-tongued philosophical missionaries who traveled with every fleet, were tasked with convincing populations to abandon their beliefs voluntarily. But when persuasion failed, and it failed often because human beings do not easily surrender the beliefs that have sustained their communities for centuries, force was applied without hesitation. On world after world, temples were demolished, sacred texts were burned, yet priests and shamans and wise women who had served their communities for generations were silenced, sometimes through re-education, sometimes through imprisonment, sometimes through methods that the imperial records describe only as necessary measures. The cultural heritage of thousands of independent human civilizations, traditions and rituals and songs and stories that had been passed down through centuries of isolation, was systematically dismantled and replaced with the cold rationalism of the imperial truth. And here is what makes this particularly tragic. Many of these religious traditions, these supposedly primitive superstitions that the emperor was so determined to eradicate, contained genuine protective value against chaos. Human beings had been dealing with the influence of the warp for millennia before the emperor's arrival. They had developed their own methods of resistance, their own spiritual technologies, their own ways of recognizing and combating the influence of malevolent entities from beyond the veil. Some of these methods were crude. Some were based on incomplete understanding. But many of them worked, in ways that the emperor either did not comprehend or chose to ignore because they did not fit within his ideological framework. The faith of a population, their ability to draw strength from shared belief, their capacity to resist despair through spiritual community, these are not weaknesses. They are survival mechanisms that have been refined by thousands of years of evolutionary pressure in a galaxy where psychic threats are real and constant. The emperor classified all of these mechanisms as superstition and destroyed them. He was like a physician who removes a patient's immune system because he disapproves of its methods, and then acts surprised when the patient succumbs to the very infection the immune system was designed to fight. When the Horus heresy came, when the reality of chaos was finally revealed to an Imperium that had been told such things were impossible, the psychological damage was catastrophic beyond measure. Space Marines who had been taught that demons did not exist found themselves face to face with entities of pure malice that defied everything they had been told about the nature of reality. Entire regiments of Imperial Army soldiers simply broke, their minds unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught to believe. Officers who had been trained in strict materialist philosophy stood paralyzed as creatures of nightmare tore through their formations, because their training had not prepared them for the possibility that nightmares could become flesh. The imperial truth, the doctrine that was supposed to protect humanity from the terrors of the warp, thus became a weapon in the hands of chaos, because the greatest terror of all is discovering that everything you believed was a lie, and the emperor knew this vulnerability existed. He knew that his doctrine was a temporary measure, a stopgap intended to last only until the Webway project was complete, and humanity could be safely insulated from the warp by physical distance rather than ideological blinders. But he told no one about the timeline. He told no one about the endgame. But he simply imposed his ideology on an entire species and trusted that his grand plan would be completed before the cracks became fatal. The cracks became fatal, and the edifice he built came crashing down in fire and blood, exactly as anyone with less arrogance might have predicted. The emperor's reasoning for this deception was ostensibly practical. He believed that religious worship and faith empowered the chaos gods by feeding them psychic energy through the warp. By eliminating religion and convincing humanity that there was nothing to believe in beyond the material world, he hoped to starve the dark gods of their power source. It was a strategic gambit, not a philosophical conviction. The emperor was not actually an atheist. He was a man who knew that gods existed and chose to lie about it because he believed the lie would serve his purposes better than the truth. But the lie failed catastrophically, or in ways that the emperor should have been able to predict. First, the imperial truth left humanity completely unprepared for the reality of chaos. When Space Marines encountered genuine demons during the Great Crusade, they had no framework for understanding what they were fighting. When the heresy came and the warp vomited its horrors into real space, the Imperium soldiers were psychologically defenseless. They had been told these things were impossible, and the cognitive dissonance between their beliefs and their experiences shattered the mental resilience of entire armies. Second, the imperial truth created a spiritual vacuum that chaos eagerly filled. Human beings have an inherent need for meaning, for purpose, for something larger than themselves to believe in. The emperor tried to suppress this need through ideology, but you cannot legislate away a fundamental aspect of human psychology. When the imperial truth could not satisfy humanity's hunger for the transcendent, people went looking for something that could, and chaos was waiting with open arms and honeyed whispers. Third, and most damningly, the imperial truth was hypocritical to its core. The emperor demanded atheism from his subjects while wielding powers that were indistinguishable from divine miracles. He claimed there were no gods while acting like one. But he surrounded himself with ritual and ceremony and symbols of authority that had every hallmark of a religion except the official label. The Imperium he built walked and talked like a theocracy in everything but name, and this contradiction was not lost on the more perceptive of his sons. Lorgar saw through the deception. He recognized that the emperor's power was not merely scientific, that there was something genuinely transcendent about his nature, and he tried to honor that truth through worship. The emperor's response was not to trust Lorgar with the real reasons for the ban on religion, not to explain the strategic necessity of denying the chaos gods their fuel, but to humiliate and punish him for seeing too clearly. Magnus saw through the deception. He understood the warp better than any other Primarch, recognized the existence of the entities within it, and tried to study them scientifically rather than worship them. The emperor's response was to ban his research and punish him for knowing too much. In both cases, the emperor had sons who were genuinely close to the truth, who might have been invaluable allies if they had been trusted with honest information. And in both cases, the emperor's obsessive need for control, his conviction that only he could be trusted with the full picture, led him to push away the very people who could have helped him most. The imperial truth was not a gift to humanity, as it was a cage. It kept people ignorant of real threats, vulnerable to real dangers, and dependent on a single being who claimed to have all the answers while hiding the most important ones. And when that being fell, when the emperor was struck down by Horus and interred upon the golden throne, the cage collapsed, and the species was left naked before enemies it did not even know existed. The cruelest irony of all is what replaced the imperial truth. But in the 10,000 years since the emperor's fall, the Imperium has developed exactly the kind of religious fanaticism that the emperor worked so hard to prevent. The imperial cult worships the emperor as a god, engages in all the superstitious practices he despised, and enforces belief with an inquisitorial apparatus that makes the Great Crusade's religious persecution look restrained by comparison. The emperor's lie did not prevent religion. It merely ensured that when religion returned, and as it inevitably would take the most extreme, most irrational, most dangerous form possible. Every prayer offered to the god emperor, every heretic burned by the ecclesiarchy, every act of fanaticism committed in the emperor's name, all of it is a monument to the failure of the imperial truth. All of it is the direct, foreseeable consequence of trying to control what people believe rather than trusting them with the truth. Well, we spoke earlier about the Emperor's return to Terra during the Great Crusade, how he left the front lines at the height of the campaign and retreated to the Imperial Palace to work on his secret webway project. Let me take you deeper into the mechanics of how the Emperor's secrecy destroyed his greatest project, because the details reveal a pattern of failure so consistent that it cannot be attributed to bad luck or unforeseeable circumstance. The webway project was not a simple construction effort. It was the most ambitious engineering undertaking in human history, an attempt to build a parallel transportation network that would eventually connect every world in the Imperium through a dimension that existed outside normal space. The original webway had been constructed by the ancient Eldari using psychically resistant materials that humanity could not replicate. The Emperor's solution was to use his own psychic power, though channeled through the Golden Throne, to protect the human-built sections from demonic intrusion. This meant that the entire project depended on a single individual maintaining constant psychic vigilance. If that individual was distracted, incapacitated, or removed from the throne for any reason, the barriers would fall and demons would flood in. This was a single point of failure so catastrophic that any competent engineer would have identified it immediately and insisted on redundancy. The Emperor, the greatest intellect in human history, either did not see this flaw or did not care. And the most likely explanation is the latter, because building redundancy would have required sharing the project with others, training other psychers to maintain the barriers, delegating authority to beings he did not fully control. And the Emperor could not do that. Then the very idea of someone else having a hand on the controls of his greatest creation was apparently more frightening to him than the risk of total catastrophic failure. The Emperor worked on this project in almost total isolation. Only Malcador the Sigillite, his closest advisor, knew the full scope of the plan. The custodian guards who fought and died defending the human-built sections of the webway from demonic incursion were not told what they were protecting or why it mattered. And they died in the dark, beneath the Imperial Palace, fighting an enemy they did not understand, for a purpose that had never been explained to them. Their sacrifice was real and it was noble, but it was also unnecessary. If they had understood what they were defending, they could have fought more effectively. If they had been told about the psychic barriers and how they worked, they could have reported weaknesses and potential breaches before they became critical. Instead, they fought blind, and they died blind because the Emperor valued his secrets more than their lives. When Magnus breached the psychic wards, the cascade of failure was immediate and devastating. Demons poured through the gaps in the barriers like water through a broken levee, flooding into the human-built tunnels and threatening to reach the surface of Terra itself. The Emperor was forced to sit on the Golden Throne full-time to hold the breach closed, becoming a prisoner of the very project he had designed to liberate humanity. The Custodians and Sisters of Silence fought a desperate holding action in the webway, but without reinforcements, without understanding of the strategic situation, without any of the support structures that a competent commander would have established for such a critical operation. They were slowly and inevitably overwhelmed. The Emperor himself admitted the scale of the failure. In his conversation with the custodian Diocletian, he stated that his great work was ruined, that the webway project had failed, and with it, humanity's best chance for a future free from the predations of chaos. He said that the Imperium was ultimately doomed, that even if Horus was defeated, someone else would take his place, that the slow decay into darkness was now inevitable, and the only question was how long it would take. This was not the lament of a hero brought low by fate. This was the confession of a man who had bet everything on a single plan, kept that plan secret from everyone who might have helped him execute it, and lost everything because his pathological need for control made cooperation impossible. The webway project did not fail because of Magnus. Magnus's interference was only possible because the Emperor had created the conditions for it. By keeping the project secret, he ensured that Magnus did not know about the fragile barriers he would damage. By banning psychic powers at Nicaea, he pushed Magnus toward the desperate sorcerous methods that caused the breach. By refusing to tell anyone about the project's importance, he ensured that no one would be in a position to help when things went wrong. The Emperor designed the Webway project to fail. Not intentionally, obviously, but the same personality traits that drove him to attempt such an ambitious project also guaranteed that it could not succeed. As he built a system with a single point of failure, and then put himself in a position where failure was all but inevitable. And the price of that failure would be paid by every human being for the next 10,000 years. This single decision, more than any other, set the stage for the Horus heresy and everything that followed. The Webway project was, in theory, the Emperor's masterstroke. The Eldar had built an interdimensional network called the Webway that allowed travel between points in the galaxy without passing through the warp. If humanity could access and expand this network, it would eliminate the need for dangerous warp travel, cut off the Chaos Gods from their primary point of contact with human civilization, and eventually allow humanity to evolve into a fully psychic species without the threat of demonic corruption. It was an ambitious plan, or possibly even a brilliant one. But its execution was a disaster of arrogance, secrecy, and catastrophic mismanagement. The Emperor kept the Webway project secret from virtually everyone, including his primarchs. He told no one why he was returning to Terra. He offered no explanation for why he was abandoning the Great Crusade at its most critical juncture. He simply named Horus as War Master, gave him command of all Imperial military forces, and disappeared into the dungeons beneath the Imperial Palace to work on a project that nobody knew about and nobody could support because nobody understood what it was for. The secrecy was, according to the Emperor, necessary to prevent an uprising by the navigator guilds, who would lose their monopoly on interstellar travel if the Webway project succeeded. This explanation makes limited sense. The navigators were powerful, certainly, but they were not more powerful than the Emperor and his primarchs combined. The risk of a navigator revolt was manageable. The risk of alienating your primarchs, of leaving them feeling abandoned and confused, of creating a power vacuum that chaos could exploit, that was not manageable. And the Emperor chose the unmanageable risk. His sons were hurt. They felt abandoned. They did not understand why their father had left them. Yet they did not understand why he was locked away on Terra, pursuing a mystery project that he would not explain. And this hurt, this confusion, this sense of being used and then discarded, became the fertile soil in which the seeds of the heresy took root. Horus, the Emperor's most beloved and most trusted son, was the first to fall. The official narrative blames Chaos for corrupting the War Master, and that is partially true. The Dark Gods did manipulate Horus, did exploit his vulnerabilities. They did show him visions designed to turn him against his father. But Chaos did not need to create Horus's resentment. It merely needed to amplify what was already there. Horus felt abandoned. He felt burdened with responsibilities he had never asked for. He felt that the Emperor saw him as a tool rather than a son. And these feelings were not irrational. They were accurate assessments of how the Emperor treated the people closest to him. The Council of Nicaea, which we discussed in the context of Magnus's tragedy, was another product of the Emperor's management style during this period. By banning psychic powers across all the legions, the Emperor deprived his armies of a vital tactical asset at the worst possible time. The librarians, the psychically gifted space marines who served as warriors and advisors within each legion, were one of the most effective countermeasures against chaos corruption. They could detect demonic influence, shield their brothers from warp-spawned attacks, and engage enemies that conventional weapons could not touch. And the Emperor, in his determination to prevent abuse of psychic power, eliminated them entirely. Think about what this meant in practical terms. When the Word-bearers began their secret conversion to chaos worship in the years before the heresy, there were no librarians to detect the psychic corruption spreading through their ranks. When Erebus and Cor Pharon conducted their dark rituals, there were no psychers trained to recognize the signatures of warp manipulation. When the taint began to spread to other legions, there was no psychic early warning system in place to sound the alarm. The Thousand Sons had been the Imperium's greatest psychic resource. Their librarians were not just warriors, they were scholars, researchers, and investigators who had spent decades developing techniques for identifying and countering warp-borne threats. They understood the Imperium better than any other organization in the Imperium outside of the Emperor's own inner circle. They had developed wards and barriers and countermeasures that could have been shared across all the legions, creating a network of psychic defense that would have made chaos infiltration extraordinarily difficult. The Emperor dismantled all of this at Nicaea, and he took the single most effective anti-chaos capability in his arsenal and shut it down because he feared what might happen if it was misused. It was the equivalent of disbanding your intelligence services because you are worried about surveillance overreach and then being surprised when enemy agents walk through your front door unopposed. And the consequences extended beyond just the heresy itself. In the 10,000 years since the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne, the absence of a robust psychic defense tradition has left the Imperium chronically vulnerable to chaos infiltration. The Inquisition exists in part to fill the gap that the librarians once occupied, but the Inquisition operates through fear and paranoia rather than trained expertise. They find corruption by burning entire populations and seeing who screams the loudest, rather than through the careful, targeted detection that trained psychers could provide. The irony is almost unbearable. But the Emperor banned psychic powers to protect humanity from the dangers of the warp, and in doing so, he ensured that humanity would be maximally vulnerable to those exact dangers at the worst possible moment. Every demonic incursion that the librarians might have detected early, every chaos cult that trained psychers might have identified before it could spread, every corrupted official that a librarian's third eye might have exposed. All of these threats went undetected because the Emperor decided that the cure was worse than the disease. He was wrong. And billions upon billions of people have paid for his mistake with their lives and their souls across 10,000 years of unnecessary suffering. The timing was suspiciously convenient for the enemies of the Imperium. The ban was enacted just before the heresy, ensuring that the legions would face chaos at their most vulnerable. In some sources suggest the Emperor had planned the Council of Nicaea decades in advance, which raises uncomfortable questions about whether he understood how it would weaken his forces and chose to proceed anyway. Others suggest the ban was a temporary measure intended to last only until the Webway project was complete, at which point psychic powers would become safer to use. But the Webway project was itself a secret, so the legions had no way of knowing that the ban was temporary, or no way of understanding the larger strategy that supposedly justified it. And then Magnus broke through the psychic wards protecting the Webway. In his desperate attempt to warn the Emperor about Horus's treachery, he inadvertently tore holes in the carefully maintained barriers that kept demons from flooding into the human-built sections of the network. The damage was catastrophic. Demons poured through the breaches, and the Emperor was forced to sit on the Golden Throne permanently to keep the portal closed, becoming a prisoner of his own creation. But here is the question we need to ask. Would Magnus have done this if he had known about the Webway project? If the Emperor had trusted his most psychically gifted son with the truth about what he was building beneath the Imperial Palace, would Magnus have chosen a different method to deliver his warning? Almost certainly yes. Magnus was brilliant, devoted, and deeply knowledgeable about the warp. If he had known about the Webway's fragile psychic barriers, he would have found another way to reach the Emperor. He would have used conventional astropathy, or sent a physical messenger, or found one of a dozen alternative methods of communication that would not have damaged the project. The destruction of the Webway project was not Magnus's fault, but it was the direct consequence of the Emperor's refusal to share vital information with the people who needed it most. The Emperor's secrecy did not protect the project, it destroyed it. His need for control did not ensure success, it guaranteed failure. And the price of that failure would be paid by every human being for the next 10,000 years. Let us talk about numbers for a moment, because sometimes the abstract horror of the Imperium only becomes real when you attach specific quantities to it. 1,000 psychers sacrificed daily to the Golden Throne. That is the baseline figure from the original lore, though by the late 36th millennium the number had quadrupled to 4,000 per day. Let us be conservative and use an average of 2,000 per day across the full 10 millennia. That gives us roughly 730,000 per year. That is 7.3 million per decade, 73 million per century, 730 million per millennium. Over the 10,000 years since the emperor was interred on the golden throne, that is approximately 7 billion human beings whose lives have been consumed to keep one individual technically alive. 7 billion. That is roughly the population of old Earth in the 21st millennium. An entire planet's worth of people are fed one by one into a machine that grinds their souls to dust so that a corpse can continue to broadcast a psychic signal across the galaxy. And this is considered acceptable. This is considered necessary. This is considered the cost of doing business in the Imperium of the Emperor. And that is just the psychers fed to the throne. It does not count the psychers who die powering the Astronomicon, which requires its own separate contingent of 10,000 trained psychers who slowly fade and die as their energy is drained away. It does not count the souls consumed by the Emperor's various psychic operations throughout the Imperium, the soul binding of astropaths, the sanctioning of navigators, the countless small expenditures of human life that keep the psychic infrastructure of the Imperium functioning. And it does not count the trillions of ordinary humans who die in wars fought in the Emperor's name, or the billions exterminated by the Inquisition on suspicion of heresy, or the uncountable masses who perish from the mundane cruelties of a system that values human life only insofar as it serves the machinery of state. The Imperium does not track these numbers. It cannot. As the scale of death is so vast that the administrative apparatus required to count the bodies would consume more resources than the Imperium can spare. Entire worlds die and are forgotten before the administratum even processes the paperwork acknowledging their existence. Generations live and die in the processing queues of a bureaucracy so vast that a message can take centuries to travel from one department to another. But there are stories in the lore of Imperial Guard regiments that continued to receive orders addressed to commanders who had been dead for hundreds of years, of tax assessments levied against worlds that had been consumed by tyrannid hive fleets decades earlier, of criminal warrants issued for individuals whose entire species had gone extinct while the paperwork was being processed. This is not dysfunction. This is the system working as designed. But the Emperor built an empire that was too large and too centralized to be governed effectively by any being other than himself. And then he was removed from the governing process. The result was inevitable. Without his guiding intelligence, the Imperium's institutions degenerated into self-perpetuating bureaucracies whose primary purpose was their own continuation, rather than the welfare of the citizens they supposedly served. And through it all, the Adeptus Mechanicus slowly loses the knowledge required to maintain the Imperium's technology. This is perhaps the cruelest dimension of the Emperor's legacy. He built a civilization on the foundation of science and reason, and that civilization has degenerated into a culture where scientific inquiry is treated as heresy and technological maintenance is performed through religious ritual. The tech priests of Mars do not understand the machines they tend. They pray to them, as they anoint them with sacred oils and chant binary liturgies and perform maintenance rites that have been passed down through 10,000 years of increasingly garbled oral tradition, and they call this the pursuit of knowledge. The seeds of this technological superstition were planted during the Emperor's own reign. The Treaty of Mars, the alliance between the Emperor and the Mechanicum that provided the industrial base for the Great Crusade, was itself a compromise with religious belief. The Mechanicum worshipped the machine god, the Omnissiah, and the Emperor allowed this worship to continue because he needed their factories and their expertise. He bent his own principles, violated his own imperial truth because pragmatism demanded it. And that compromise, that exception to his supposedly absolute ideological stance, grew over the millennia into the technology-worshipping cult that now holds the Imperium's machines together with prayer and incense rather than understanding and innovation. Everything the Imperium has become, every dimension of its horror and dysfunction and despair can be traced back to choices the Emperor made. The theocratic tyranny he would have despised grows from the spiritual vacuum he created. The technological stagnation he would have mourned grows from the compromises he permitted. The endless, purposeless wars he would have condemned grow from the militaristic civilization he designed. The daily sacrifice of innocent souls grows from the failed project that imprisoned him on the very throne he had built for a different purpose entirely. Imagine being one of those psychers for a moment. You were born with a gift you did not ask for, a sensitivity to the warp that marked you as different from the moment your powers first manifested. You were taken from your family, often as a child, by the black ships of the Astra Telepathica. You endured a journey through the void that killed a significant percentage of your fellow captives. You arrived on Terra, a world you had only heard of in prayers, expecting perhaps to be trained, to be given purpose, to serve the Imperium in some meaningful capacity. Instead, you were fed to a machine. Your soul was drawn out of your body and consumed by the Golden Throne. Yet your life force used as fuel to sustain the Emperor's psychic projection for a few more hours. You died screaming, your consciousness shredded by forces beyond mortal comprehension, and you were immediately replaced by the next body in the queue. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement, no record of your name. You were fuel, nothing more, consumed and forgotten in the space between one heartbeat and the next. And this has been happening every single day for 10,000 years. And not because there is no alternative, but because the Emperor built a system that requires it. He designed the Golden Throne. He chose to power it with human souls. He created the conditions that make the Astronomicon necessary. Every dimension of this horror is downstream of his engineering choices, his strategic decisions, his fundamental belief that individual human lives are expendable resources to be spent in service of the greater plan. Yet the defenders of the Emperor will argue that this sacrifice is necessary, that without the Astronomicon, warp travel would be impossible, and the Imperium would collapse. And they are correct. But the reason the Imperium is dependent on warp travel is that the Emperor's Webway project failed. The reason the Webway project failed is that the Emperor kept it secret from the people who needed to know about it. The reason the Golden Throne requires souls is that the Emperor designed it that way, and at every step, the necessity of the current horror can be traced back to an earlier decision by the Emperor that created the conditions requiring it. He built a house of cards, and when it collapsed, he used human bodies to shore up the foundations. There is an image that defines the Imperium of man in the 41st millennium, and it is not a glorious one. It is the image of the Golden Throne, that ancient, arcane, or slowly failing life support system buried deep beneath the imperial palace on Terra, and the withered, rotting corpse that sits upon it. The Emperor has been dying for 10,000 years. His body is a ruin, held together by technology that no one fully understands, and psychic will that defies comprehension. His mind remains active in the warp, maintaining the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that makes interstellar travel possible, and fighting an endless war against the demonic entities that would flood through the broken Webway portal if he ever relaxed his vigilance. But keeping the Emperor alive and the Astronomicon burning requires fuel. And that fuel is human souls. Every single day, 1,000 psychers are sacrificed to the Golden Throne. Their life energy is drained away and consumed to sustain the Emperor's failing body and power, the beacon that holds the Imperium together. These are not willing sacrifices, or at least not all of them are. Many are taken by the black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, gathered from across the Imperium in a tithe of human misery that never ends. They are brought to Terra, prepared through training and indoctrination, and then fed into the machine that keeps the corpse of a would-be god barely functional. By the late 36th millennium, the demands of the Golden Throne had increased dramatically. 4 times as many psychers were now required daily to maintain optimal power levels. The black ships increased in number and frequency, harvesting ever more human beings with psychic potential from the Imperium's worlds. The mathematics of this are horrifying. 1,000 psychers a day is 365,000 per year. Over 10,000 years, that is billions of human lives consumed to keep one being alive. Billions of conscious, feeling, thinking human beings, and each with their own hopes and fears and dreams, reduced to fuel for a machine they never chose to serve. And what has this sacrifice purchased? What has the Imperium become in the 10 millennia since the Emperor was interred upon the golden throne? It has become exactly the kind of nightmare that the Emperor supposedly wanted to prevent. The Imperium of man in the 41st millennium is not a civilization. It is a machine for the production of suffering on an industrial scale. It is a totalitarian theocracy that worships as a god, the very being who claimed he was not one. It is a bureaucratic horror show in which the lives of individual human beings have less value than the ammunition expended to defend them. It is a society where the concepts of progress, reform, and improvement have been replaced by dogma, stagnation, and the slow grinding decay of everything the Emperor supposedly built. The imperial creed enforces worship of the Emperor with torture and death, yet the Inquisition hunts heretics with methods that would make the worst excesses of history's real inquisitions look civilized. Entire worlds are sterilized, their populations exterminated, at the first sign of chaos taint, a policy that kills far more innocents than it saves. The Adeptus Mechanicus treats scientific innovation as heresy, ensuring that the technological base of the Imperium slowly deteriorates with each passing century. The Administratum, and the sprawling bureaucracy that nominally governs the Imperium, is so vast and so inefficient that vital messages can take centuries to reach their destinations, by which time the worlds they concern may no longer exist. This is the Emperor's legacy. This is the civilization his choices built. And while some might argue that this dystopian nightmare is not what he intended, that the Imperium degenerated into this state only after his fall, that argument does not hold up to scrutiny. The Emperor built an empire that could not function without him. He centralized power to such a degree that his removal from the picture left no viable mechanisms for effective governance. He created no checks and balances, no distributed systems of leadership, no constitutional framework that could survive the loss of its founder. He designed the Imperium as an extension of his will, and when that will was removed, the whole structure began its inevitable collapse into authoritarianism and decay. He could have built something different. He could have established institutions that did not depend on his personal presence. He could have trained successors, shared power, created redundancies. Guilliman proved in Ultramar that such systems were possible, that an efficient, well-governed civilization could function perfectly well without a god-king at its center. But the Emperor chose not to follow Guilliman's example. He chose to make himself indispensable, and then he was removed from the equation and everything fell apart. The irony is that when Guilliman was resurrected in the 41st millennium and saw what the Imperium had become, his reaction was horror. He called the Imperium a terrible thing, an edifice of corpses that bore no resemblance to the civilization the Emperor had claimed to be building. And Guilliman was right, but he was also wrong to be surprised. The Imperium did not betray the Emperor's vision, it fulfilled it. Because the Emperor's vision was never about freedom or prosperity or the betterment of humanity. It was about control, and control, in the absence of the controller, always decays into tyranny. The daily sacrifice of psychers, the inquisitorial purges, the enforced ignorance, the technological stagnation, the endless, purposeless wars. None of this is an aberration. All of it is the natural evolution of a system designed by a being who viewed people as resources rather than individuals, who valued obedience over autonomy, who believed that the right to make decisions for the entire human species belonged to him and him alone. Let me paint you a picture of daily life in the Imperium that the Emperor built, not in the grand, sweeping terms of galactic warfare and cosmic threats, but in the small, grinding details that define the existence of an average human being in the 41st millennium. You are born on a hive world. Your parents are factory workers. They work 16-hour shifts in a manufactorum that produces bolt rounds. They have never met a space marine. They have never left their hive level. The air you breathe is recycled and foul, thick with industrial toxins that will shorten your life by decades. The food you eat is corpse starch and a processed nutrient paste made from organic waste. You have never tasted fresh fruit. You have never seen a tree. You have never felt sunlight on your skin. You will begin working when you are old enough to operate the machines, which on most hive worlds means somewhere between 8 and 12 years of age. You will work there until your body gives out, which happens around 40 if you are lucky. If you are drafted into the Imperial Guard, you will be shipped off to die on a world whose name you cannot pronounce, fighting enemies you do not understand, in a war that will continue long after your bones have turned to dust. And throughout your entire existence, you will be told that this is good, that this is righteous, that the Emperor has ordained this life for you, that your suffering has meaning because it serves his divine plan. This is not a worst-case scenario. This is the average. This is what life looks like for the majority of the Imperium's untold trillions of citizens. And it is not the result of alien invasion or chaos corruption. It is the result of the system functioning as designed. The Imperium was built to extract maximum productivity from its population at minimum cost, to treat human beings as resources to be consumed rather than lives to be valued, to prioritize the survival of the state over the welfare of the individuals who comprise it. And the man who designed that system sits on the golden throne, consuming 1,000 souls a day, while priests in his name tell the suffering masses that their agony is a gift. The Emperor did not build a civilization, he built a prison, and for 10,000 years, humanity has been living in it. In the novel Master of Mankind, there is a moment that captures the true nature of the Emperor more clearly than perhaps any other passage in the entire Warhammer 40,000 canon. The Emperor is speaking with one of his custodian guards, a warrior named Diocletian, about the state of the Imperium and the war against chaos. And Diocletian asks the Emperor what will happen if the Webway project fails completely, if the Imperium cannot be saved. The Emperor's response is bleak beyond measure. He states that the Imperium is ultimately doomed, that even if Horus is defeated, someone else will take his place, that the dream he had for humanity is dead. Yes, and what remains is merely a question of how long the dying takes. A year or 10,000, it makes no difference. The end result is the same. This is the Emperor's own assessment of his work, his own acknowledgement that everything he built has failed. And the question that hangs in the air after this confession is, whose fault is that? The Chaos Gods bear their share of responsibility, certainly. They are malevolent entities who actively worked to undermine the Emperor's plans, who scattered his Primarchs, corrupted his sons, and engineered the heresy. The traitor Primarchs, who chose to follow Horus, bear responsibility for their choices, even if those choices were influenced by legitimate grievances and supernatural manipulation. The universe itself bears some blame, being a hostile, uncaring void that rewards ruthlessness and punishes idealism. But when you trace every thread back to its origin, when you follow every chain of causation to its first link, you keep arriving at the same place, the Emperor's doorstep. He created the Primarchs using warp energy, making them vulnerable to chaos corruption. He refused to tell them about chaos, ensuring they could not protect themselves. He treated them as tools rather than people, ensuring they would feel no loyalty when the test came. He built an empire that depended entirely on his personal presence, ensuring it would collapse without him. He promoted an ideology based on a lie, ensuring that humanity would be psychologically defenseless against the truths he denied. He kept his most important projects secret from everyone, ensuring that when it was accidentally damaged, no one understood how to help repair it. He chose conquest over cooperation, speed over sustainability, control over trust, at every single decision point throughout his entire existence. The Emperor of Mankind is not a hero who was betrayed by ungrateful sons and cosmic forces beyond his control. Yet he is the architect of his own damnation and the damnation of his entire species. Every horror of the 41st millennium, every atrocity committed in his name, every soul sacrificed to keep his rotting corpse alive for one more day, all of it flows from his choices, his failures, his pathological inability to trust anyone with anything, ever. The really damning thing is that the Emperor knew better. He was tens of thousands of years old. He had watched civilizations rise and fall, yet he had seen what tyranny produced, what secrecy created, what happened when you built systems around a single indispensable individual. He had all of human history to learn from, and he repeated its worst mistakes on a galactic scale. Was the galaxy a hostile place? Yes. Were the threats facing humanity genuinely existential? Absolutely. Did the Emperor face impossible choices with no good options? Sometimes. But the consistent pattern of his decisions, the unbroken chain of secrecy and manipulation and betrayal and control, reveals a character who was not reluctantly doing terrible things because circumstances demanded it. He was doing terrible things because that was who he was. Because he fundamentally could not conceive of a relationship with another being that was not one of domination and subordination. Because he viewed humanity not as a family to be nurtured, but as a project to be managed. And he could not tolerate any deviation from his design. There is a passage in the lore where the Emperor is asked why he allowed the Primarchs to call him father when he felt no fatherly attachment to them. His answer was to reference the story of Pinocchio, the puppet who wanted to become a real boy. He said it was only natural for a creation to refer to its creator as father. He did not correct the term, because doing so would have been inconvenient. He let his sons believe in a relationship that he knew was false, because it served his purposes to let them believe. This is not a hero's moment. This is not the act of a man who loves his children, but cannot show it. This is the cold calculation of a being who sees emotional attachment as a lever to be pulled, a vulnerability to be exploited, a useful fiction to be maintained, as long as it produces obedience. The Emperor did not love the Primarchs. He did not love humanity. He loved his plan. And when the plan required the destruction of everything his people cared about, he did not hesitate. Let me put it plainly. The Chaos Gods are monsters, but they are honest monsters. They do not pretend to be anything other than what they are. Horn does not claim to be your friend while sharpening the axe for your neck. Nurgle does not promise you health while infecting your lungs. The Chaos Gods are predators who wear their predation openly. The Emperor is something worse. He is a predator who wears the face of a savior. He is a tyrant who wraps his tyranny in the language of liberation. He is a manipulator who demands trust while trusting no one. He is the most dangerous kind of villain, one who genuinely believes he is the hero, who is so convinced of his own righteousness that he cannot see the suffering he creates, who would burn the galaxy to save it and call the ashes a triumph. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And the war was started by the man sitting on the golden throne. Let me put it another way. Consider every major catastrophe in the history of the Imperium and ask yourself, could the Emperor have prevented it? The Horus Heresy. Could it have been prevented? Yes. If the Emperor had told his sons about chaos, they would have been prepared to resist it. If he had treated them as partners rather than tools, they would have had no reason to turn against him. While if he had shared the Webway project with Magnus, the psychic breach would never have occurred. If he had saved Angron's gladiators, the Red Angel would have been a loyal champion. If he had handled Lorgar with empathy rather than humiliation, the word-bearers would never have become the first servants of the Dark Gods. Every single traitor Primarch can be traced back to a specific failure of the Emperor's leadership. There's a specific moment where a different choice would have produced a different outcome. The corruption of the Imperium into a theocratic nightmare. Could it have been prevented? Yes. If the Emperor had built institutions that could function without him, the transition to the post-heresy era would not have required the deification he despised. If he had been honest about the nature of the warp, rather than building a civilization on a lie, the inevitable collapse of that lie would not have created a spiritual vacuum that religious fanaticism eagerly filled. If he had trusted humanity with the truth, humanity could have developed genuine spiritual defenses against chaos, rather than the hollow rituals of the imperial cult. The technological regression. Could it have been prevented? Yes. If the emperor had genuinely committed to the imperial truth's ideals of scientific progress rather than using them as a propaganda tool, as the Imperium would have developed a culture of genuine inquiry rather than one of ritual maintenance. If he had not compromised with the Mechanicum's religious beliefs about technology, the knowledge base would not have been locked behind layers of superstitious ceremony. If he had invested in education and understanding rather than obedience and compliance, the Imperium's technological foundation would have been far more resilient. The endless wars. Could they have been prevented? Well, perhaps not all of them. The galaxy is genuinely hostile, and some conflicts are unavoidable. But the scale of the Imperium's warfare, the sheer volume of human life expended in campaigns that serve no strategic purpose, that are fought over territory that has no value, that continue for centuries because no one has the authority to call them off. This is not a consequence of external threats. This is a consequence of building a civilization around warfare and then being unable to transition it to any other mode of existence. The Emperor built the Imperium for war because war was the tool he understood best. He was, at his core, a conqueror, not a statesman, not a philosopher, not a caretaker, a conqueror. And conquerors build empires that are optimized for conquest, which means they are fundamentally unsuited for anything else. When the conquering stops, yes, when the wars are supposed to end and the empire is supposed to transition to peacetime governance, the whole structure begins to collapse because it was never designed to do anything other than fight. Guilliman understood this. He built Ultramar specifically to be a post-war civilization, a model for what the Imperium could become when the fighting finally ended. And the Emperor ignored it. He had no interest in what would come after, because in his mind, there was no after. There was only the plan, the webway, the evolution of humanity, the defeat of chaos. Everything else was secondary, including the welfare of the billions who lived and died in the present, while the Emperor focused exclusively on a future that would never arrive. This is the ultimate indictment of the Emperor of mankind. Not that he was cruel, though he was. Not that he was dishonest, though he was. Not that he was arrogant, though he was. The ultimate indictment is that he sacrificed the present for a future he could not deliver. He demanded that an entire species endure unimaginable suffering in service of a plan that his own personality guaranteed would fail. He asked humanity to trust him with everything, and then proved himself unworthy of that trust at every possible opportunity. The Emperor is not a fallen hero. He is a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when you give unlimited power to a being who believes, one with absolute conviction, that he alone knows what is best. A demonstration of how the noblest intentions can produce the most horrific outcomes when they are pursued without humility, without transparency, without the willingness to admit error and change course. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and the architect of that endless war sits on a golden chair, consuming the souls of the innocent, while the civilization he built burns around him. And not because he was defeated by his enemies, but because he defeated himself. So what does all of this mean for us, as people who enjoy this setting and these stories? It means that Warhammer 40,000 is even richer and more complex than it might appear on the surface. The setting is not about good versus evil, heroes versus villains, light versus darkness. It is about the ways that power corrupts, the ways that good intentions pave the road to hell, the ways that even the most extraordinary beings can be undone by their own flaws. The Emperor is not interesting because he is a hero. He is interesting because he is a tragedy, because he had every gift imaginable, every advantage, every opportunity to build something beautiful, and he squandered it all because he could not do the one thing that would have saved everything: trust someone other than himself. The Imperium is not worth fighting for because it is good. It is worth fighting for because it is all humanity has. And it is all humanity has because the Emperor, in his infinite wisdom and his bottomless arrogance, made sure that no alternative could survive. He destroyed every independent human civilization during the Great Crusade. He eliminated every potential path to a different future. He made the Imperium the only game in town, and then he broke it so thoroughly that 10,000 years of effort have not been enough to fix it. As this is the genius of Warhammer 40,000 as a setting. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between savior and tyrant is not always clear, that the people we worship as heroes may be the architects of our suffering, that the greatest threats we face may not come from the darkness outside, but from the light we have been taught to follow without question. The Emperor of Mankind is the real villain of Warhammer 40,000, not because he is evil in the simple cartoonish sense, not because he twirls his mustache and laughs at the suffering of innocents, but because he is the one who set the board, who arranged the pieces, who designed the game that has been playing itself out for 10 millennia. Every chaos incursion, every alien invasion, every inquisitorial purge, every world burned in the Emperor's name, all of it is downstream of his decisions. All of it is the fruit of seeds he planted. And the cruelest part, he knew, sitting on the golden throne, but watching his Imperium decay into everything he claimed to oppose, the Emperor admitted that it was doomed, that his dream was dead, that nothing he had built would endure. He knew, and he kept going anyway. Not because he had hope, not because he saw a path to redemption, but because stopping would mean admitting that everything he had done, every life he had spent, every civilization he had destroyed, every son he had driven into the arms of chaos, had been for nothing. In the end, that is the most human thing about the Emperor of Mankind. Not his power, not his vision, not his sacrifice, his inability to admit he was wrong, his stubborn, catastrophic refusal to let go of a plan that had failed, even as it dragged an entire species into the abyss. His conviction, held to the very last, that he and he alone knew what was best for humanity, even as the evidence of his failure mounted around him like the walls of a tomb. The Emperor protects, they say. But the question no one asks is, who protects us from the Emperor? Think about what the Imperium might have been. Think about what it could have looked like if the Emperor had built it differently. If instead of a galactic tyranny held together by force and ignorance, he had built a federation of worlds that respected local autonomy while cooperating against shared threats. If instead of suppressing knowledge about chaos, he had educated humanity about it and given them the tools to defend themselves. If instead of creating disposable super soldiers to conquer the galaxy by force, he had invested in diplomacy and the slow, patient work of building genuine alliances. Guilliman proved in Ultramar that such a civilization was possible. The 500 worlds of Ultramar were prosperous, well-governed, and stable. They had effective local leadership, efficient economies, and populations that served the Imperium not because they were forced to, but because they genuinely believed in its principles. Imagine an Imperium built on that model. An Imperium where worlds governed themselves while contributing to a common defense. Where knowledge about chaos was openly taught so that people could recognize and resist corruption. Where the Primarchs served as advisors and protectors rather than conquerors and enforcers. Such an Imperium would have been less grandiose. It would have been messier, more complicated, slower to expand. But it would have been resilient in a way the actual Imperium never was. It would have survived the loss of any single leader because its strength would have been distributed rather than centralized. And it would have offered its people something the actual Imperium never could. Genuine freedom, genuine meaning, genuine hope for a future that was not just more of the same grinding darkness. The Emperor did not build this Imperium because he could not imagine it. For all his thousands of years of life, for all his godlike intelligence, he could not conceive of a human civilization that did not require a god at its center. He could not trust humanity to find its own way. And so he built the Imperium in his own image, an image of control and secrecy and domination, and humanity has been paying the price ever since. Every hive worker slaving in darkness, every guardsman dying on a world whose name he never learned, every psyker screaming as their soul is fed to the golden throne, all of them are living in the world the Emperor made. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and the Emperor of mankind paved a road that stretches across 1,000,000 worlds, lined on both sides with the graves of everyone who believed his promises. The Chaos Gods did not destroy humanity's future. The Emperor did. He just used more gold paint. That is going to do it for this one. I hope this journey through the darker side of the Emperor's legacy gave you something to think about, something to chew on the next time you see that golden figure on the tabletop or read about his deeds in the novels. The beauty of this setting is that there are no easy answers, and the conversation about who is truly responsible for the state of the galaxy is one that will never be fully settled. That is what makes it so endlessly fascinating. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps this channel grow and allows me to keep making content like this for you. If you have your own thoughts about the Emperor's morality, if you think I got something wrong, if you think there are angles I missed, drop a comment below. I read every single one of them, and I love hearing your perspectives. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Take care of yourselves out there, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, the truth is always more complicated than the stories we are told. Until next time.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.